Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream by podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Robert and Price. And today we're going to be talking about James the Just. Is James really the brother of Jesus, and what can we know about him? So, Bob, once again, thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Jacob. The whole James thing, it's interesting that the question only arises as a problem if you're a mythicist, which I tend to be. I mean, I put most of my eggs in that basket. But I always admit that that's simply a reconstruction, a hypothesis that on many grounds makes the most sense to me, but I don't hold it as a dogma and I don't see how it can be proved. That's the way it is ultimately with all scholarly hypotheses. But let's see why it's not a problem for anybody else. It isn't a problem with even with Roman Catholics who professed the perpetual virginity of Mary, because they long ago figured out what this would mean, even if that were true. Some thought that Mary was a young woman, almost a girl, and that she married Joseph, who was an older man, a much older man, just so that Jesus wouldn't be born legally illegitimately. It wouldn't be considered a bastard, as a Jewish polemic made him. They used to call him the mamzer and the fatherless one, and so on. But if that's the case, then they could say, well, yeah, I know it says he has brothers, James, Judas, Simon, and Joseph. Yeah, sure. But that they're just not getting into the specifics. That if this theory were the case, then they would simply be Jesus' step brothers. But what the heck? That's not much of a stretch. Then, of course, some say that some Roman Catholics have said, well, the word adelphoi, adelphoi, sisters and brothers, would just be cousins, and that's apparently linguistically possible, but not likely, not the usual denotation of these words. But it's not impossible. Another ancient venerable Catholic theory is that they were the let's see, what would you say? Well, let's say let's just stick to the Protestant theory that says Mary was a virgin when she conceived Jesus because of the Holy Spirit. But afterward, she and Joseph did cohabit and have relations, and that James and the others were the result of those unions, and that would make them the half brothers and sisters of Jesus. It's not impossible, but of course it's offensive to Roman Catholics and the original reformers, by the way, the earliest generation of them, who did believe in the virginal conception and the perpetual virginity of Mary. But nonetheless, it's not like if that it's going to be a huge problem if Jesus wasn't deemed to be the brother of James and vice versa. So for whom is it a problem? Well, of course, that's just mythicists, because they / we would say that Jesus wasn't a historical figure. So, in what sense could he be the brother if siblinghood is intended? So there you have to, so really the whole thing sort of, there's an easy solution to this if mythicism is wrong. If you're not a mythicist, you don't really have a problem on your hands. But suppose you are, then what are you to make of James, the so-called brother of the Lord? Well, this gets complicated, but not confusing, I think. If you're just ready to keep separate things separate. For one thing, suppose you assume that Jesus and James were both historical founders. They still needn't have been actual relatives any more than it's likely that a historical Jesus and a historical John the Baptist were actually cousins. Why does anybody think they are? Solely because Luke's gospel has this nativity story, the twin nativities of Jesus and John the Baptist, in which we find out that the mothers of the two saints were cousins. So that would make Jesus and John cousins. We never hear anything about that otherwise. In fact, it doesn't exactly even fit with the rest of Luke, since Luke gives no hint that John the Baptist knew who Jesus was when he baptized him. So suppose we were to think of the claim for James's being Jesus' brother is closely analogous to that of John the Baptist being Jesus' cousin. Well, what that would mean is that what is true of the one was just as likely true of the other. And what I think the John connection is that it was purely a piece of theological fiction designed to pursue Luke's agenda and John's Gospels, by the way, an attempt to refute the notion that John the Baptist was the Messiah, but to not alienate John the Baptist followers whom they were trying to win over to Christian conversion. So it was a strategic move to say, hey, John wasn't the Messiah. Now, I mean, look how he turned out, kind of came to nothing, though the movement still existed. Why don't you come over and accept Jesus as the true Messiah? And it's not like we hate John, as, by the way, some Christians did and viewed him as like the father of false prophecies, but not the New Testament writers. They were willing to say, hey, we can co-opt the John group by saying, we're giving your man a position of honor in our pantheon. So is Saint John the Baptist, we're his fans. It's just that he's not the Messiah. How about it? Not all of them accepted it, because we still have the Mandean sect today who claim to be the descendants of the sect of John the Baptist, and I see no reason to doubt that. They, however, still say that Jesus was a false Messiah and that John was the real one. So it seems to me the association of John with Jesus as his cousin is simply a kind of propaganda device to link the two together, to absorb the John the Baptist people without having to say, you're wrong, you're following a quack, a charlatan. No, great man. And that may be where the saying comes in, of men born of women, there's never been one greater than John the Baptist. Well, except, of course, for anybody that joins up with the kingdom of God, with Jesus. But that ain't bad, right? So that's what happened. And it might be that the same sort of maneuver happened in order to try to assimilate the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Essenes, or whatever you think they were, into Christianity. Because and of course this assumes what Robert Eisenman and some others argued, that the Qumran teacher of righteousness was James the Just, who was like a saintly figure in his own right and didn't have anything to do with Jesus. But there's certainly no clash. I mean, comparing the two, it's not apples and oranges. And so it might be that this was an attempt to link the two movements by saying, your teacher of righteousness is James the Just. He was Jesus' brother. Yeah, why not? Same thing. That to me is a viable possibility, though no more than that. Let me just say that in doing this, if they did, this would be a long distance echo of something they did in Genesis, when they would form genealogical lists and say that Abraham had the two wives, or the wife and the concubine, Sarah and Hagar, and the son of each of them had 12 children who were the founders of 12 tribes. And then you go back to Abraham and you say he was the cousin of Lot. And Lot had a couple of nations that came from him. Well, did they really keep such records? I guess they might have, but it kind of seems like what they were, as Hermann Gunkel, almost the father of form criticism, said. It looks like what they were doing here was simply to formally seal certain relations between clans and groups so as to forge trade relations, alliances, and things like that. To say that, well, your 12 tribe confederacy, which is probably formed by 12 originally independent tribes, saying, I bet our 12 tribal progenitors were all brothers and the sons of Abraham. And then later on down the line, the Israelites are doing the same thing. I'll bet all of our tribal patriarchs, progenitors, the whole mess of them, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, all of them, they must have been brothers, sons of one man. Even in First Maccabees, you have Judah Maccabee allying himself with the Greek Spartans because he's just discovered they have a common ancestor. It's like a legal fiction. That same practice may have been reflected in the association of either or both John the Baptist and James the Just with Jesus. Now, to take this a step further, this would work most naturally if you figured that there was a historical Jesus remembered as the Christian founder, because presumably there was a historical John the Baptist, though some have argued otherwise, and a historical James the Just. Well, in that case, wouldn't it be kind of natural to think of Jesus being one of the same type? Yeah, that would make a lot of sense, but it doesn't really prove it. It's just a question of what Christians thought their founder was by the time assimilation and unification was attempted. Maybe he wasn't a historical individual, but had by this time been historicized. Even according to mythicism, there was a point where that happened, when Christians began to think, I bet there was a historical founder. And that's why we know we have the copyrighted teachings. The apostles gave us what they heard from the horse's mouth. It wasn't just a bunch of visions and stuff. So I know this is very complicated, but I'm saying the idea of grafting James onto Jesus' genealogy might have been simply a genealogical fiction reflecting the assimilation of elements of the two movements. Now, suppose James the Just was the actual physical brother of Jesus, and presumably the eldest of the bunch who were enumerated in, Mark chapter 6, I think it is. Then what would that tell us? Would that shed any light on anything else in the New Testament? Well, yes, it would. And this is one reason it's a strong hypothesis. Even as a mythicist, I don't reject it as the idea of a real Jesus and a real James brothers. I don't reject that as untenable. It's quite plausible. And here's why. It would tie up several loose ends. For one, it would explain how James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church, as he seems to be already in Acts, after the story of Peter's near martyrdom. How once the angel lets Peter go from death row, he reports to his disciples and said, well, I'm getting out of here. Please go tell James. Well, he'd know certainly. Well, mustn't that mean something like, you're next in line. And sure enough, in Acts 15, James is the one who makes the decisions, even when Peter is recalled to participate in the Jerusalem council or whatever, should the Gentiles be forced to keep the Torah. And Paul says, oh, no, no. And even Peter says no. And the Pharisees say, Christian Pharisees say, oh, yes, they must. James comes up with this compromised position. Well, they don't have to keep the whole Torah, but there's no real point in them being scofflaws and making a point of not keeping the Torah. How about if for decorum's sake they agree to these 4 basic provisions? Nobody's going to be too outraged about that. Well, so he's pictured as the head honcho. Well, here's another interesting thing. In the Clementine, either it's the recognitions of the homilies, if not both, we have a letter supposedly written by Peter to James, where he addresses James as if he's the one in authority. And he says something about how all Christian missionaries, evangelists, must check in with James to report. Well, that implies it's James and not Peter. And so here is a scenario where James is the substitute for Jesus. One might say the Caliph, ruling the church in place of the departed Jesus. This would be just like in Islam, at least the official account of it, right? Where Muhammad dies and there is a brief power struggle between the so-called companions, the earliest disciples of Muhammad, like Abu Bakr and Uthman and Umar, on the one hand, and the pillars, as they were called, the relatives of Muhammad. Of course, the pillars are what the relatives of Jesus were also called. But anyway, they were Fatima and Ali, who was, I believe, Muhammad's cousin and adopted son. They figured, well, hey, succession should follow the genealogical line. But the companion said, well, no. It's the earliest disciples who stuck with him through thick and thin. Similarly, let me get this straight. Think of what happened when Joseph Smith died. Immediately, there was a succession dispute. You had the main group say, well, he chose 12 apostles. They should decide among themselves who will be the new prophet and seer in charge of the church. And so they did. And this guy was no relative of Smith's. But on the other hand, a minority faction led by the surviving relatives of Joseph Smith said, oh, no, it's got to be Joseph Smith Jr. The prophetic mantle must pass down to his lineal descendants. And that became the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today, it's called the Community of Christ, I think. Well, you see the idea here, or you could say, take the Nation of Islam. When Elijah Muhammad died, you had a split because his son took over and said, okay, I'm going to make some changes. You know, we're a little heretical compared to Sunni Islam. I think we ought to change some things and get closer to the mainstream. But there was one of the companions of Elijah Muhammad, namely Minister Farrakhan, who said, nothing doing. I believed in Elijah Muhammad, and I still believe in him. So what he says goes, and you've got the split. It could be the same thing. You even got a Baha'i parallel, but I won't go into that one. This is the kind of thing that happens. And so this would explain something that we seem to find in 1 Corinthians 15. You know, where in the list of resurrection appearances, it says he appeared to Peter and the 12, and then to James and all the apostles. Well, for centuries, readers had said, well, wait a minute, what's the difference between the 12 and all the apostles? Is the apostles, does that refer to a larger group, but wouldn't that include the 12? Or what? Well, Adolf Harnack said, no, here's the answer. This implies what we could surmise on other grounds, that there were two, at least, Jewish Christian factions from early days. One adhering to Simon Peter, on this rock I will build my church and the whole thing. One of the companions, the disciples of Jesus. And so his followers said, well, look, Peter's the man. Jesus appeared to him when he rose from the dead. Oh yeah, said the Jacobites, you might say the James faction, saying, no, it was his brother James. Just like in the Gospel of the Hebrews, where he appears to James the Just and says, and we find out that James was at the Last Supper and took a vow of abstinence that he was not going to eat a single Ritz cracker until the Son of Man should be risen from the dead. Wait a second, what's going on here? Well, they had the slogan, he appeared to James and all the apostles, and there were competing slogans. Well, Harnack said that didn't last, because when the principles died and it was becoming ancient history already, and the Jewish Christian faction said, look, we got enough to deal with from non-Christians and Paulinists. Why don't we just close ranks? Well, the way to do that was to combine their slogans and say, well, they don't exactly fit together, but if they're in the same list, they do, make of it what you will. So he appeared after his resurrection to Peter and the disciples, the 12, and James and all the apostles. I can't think of a better explanation, and this is what he called, what Harnack and later Stauffer called the Caliphate of James. And it's the parallel, really an exact one, as parallel with the break between Shiite and Sunni Muslims at the same stage. Oh yeah, one last one. The Gospel of Thomas, where the disciples say, look, we know you're about to leave us. Who do we go to then? And Jesus says, wherever you're coming from, you must go, I would say, check in with James the Just, on whose account heaven and earth were created. Well, okay, that has to be from the pro-James faction again. And who is it that is to check in with him? The missionaries, just like in that letter of Peter to James. Oh, and one last one. I nearly forgot this. Can't believe it. I'm going senile here. Why is it that the disciples are pictured as bums and morons in Mark's gospel, but sort of somewhat rehabilitated in Matthew and Luke, not so much in John, but that, and in fact, Jesus repudiates them apparently in Mark. Your mother and your brothers are outside speaking. Oh, there must be some mistake. My mother and sister and brothers are right here already. They're the ones that hear the word of God and do it. Sorry, ma'am, he says, you don't have proper credentials. And they must have left in a huff. And it already said they were coming to see how Jesus was, because the rumor was he had gone insane. This has to be an attempt to say, I don't care if you're Jesus' Siamese twin. You don't have any rights over any Tom, Dick, or Harriet that follows him. Same thing within Luke. Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that nursed you. And he says, no. Blessed is whoever hears the word of God and does it. You can't tell me there's not a sharp edge to that. And also, how about John's gospel? What about the brethren of Jesus? Hey, Mr. Big, you're trying to get a reputation, aren't you? Well, presumably you got to go up to the feast. If you want a reputation, you got to do your stuff in public. No, thanks. I'll sit this one out. And then at the cross, Why doesn't Jesus give his mother, for Pete's sake, into the keeping of his brothers, who the same gospel mentions? He knew about them. Well, apparently he didn't trust them. He figured the beloved disciple would be a better bet. Why is this? Why these different portrayals? Because somebody in the early church followed the so-called heirs of Jesus, also the pillars or the desposunoi, those associated with the despotes, the Lord, and therefore despised the upstart apostles who they thought were trying to steal the glory. And it was just the mirror image on the other side. You're not going to follow these people that brag about being Jesus' flesh and blood. Ken, what difference does that make? No, look at how he treated them, how they treated him. They thought he was crazy. No. You better stick with those who follow in the footsteps of the disciples. So it seems to me that the idea of a James Caliphate does answer an awful lot of questions. And that would, I guess, on the whole, imply a real historical Jesus. And in fact, that is what I deem to be the only really strong case for a historical Jesus. And yet it is not a total refutation, because by far most of the objections to a historical Jesus remain untouched by that. So as often you've got conflicting pieces of evidence, and it's impossible to know which way to go. I certainly don't know, but I'm trying to be fair, because both sides do have genuine. Nobody is stupid in this debate. There are good arguments on both sides.
What do you think the historical James's theology was? How do you sort that out from the text that we have?
Well, it could be otherwise, but I think from everything that is said by early church fathers like Hegesippus, and what Josephus says, assuming he's talking about James, our James, the Pseudo-Clementines and so on, and even Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, James must have represented a Torah Christianity. In fact, if you think about it, the Pauline view to Jewish believers in Jesus would have seemed crazy. Like, wait a second. You're saying this guy fulfilled the predictions of the Jewish Messiah, but he came to abolish the Jewish law? What are you talking about? He's the last guy in the world that would do that. I am the one sent by God to trash his laws. Well, what? No, I'm afraid not. So you can see how they're given the opposition Paul is remembered as having in the epistles, whoever wrote them. That certainly implies James was like the men from James and Galatians that make Peter to say, well, I was going to take a kind of live and let live attitude, but maybe I won't, at least while for the duration of their visit. That implies that you've got a kind of authoritative and authoritarian Torah Christianity that survived as the Ebionites. So he must have been one of them if he did, whether or not he existed.
What do you make of the letter of Galatians? What kind of texts and stories do you think that letter is working from, in light of the view that you have and others have, and a view I share, that the pre-war Paul did not compose Galatians? Is Galatians historical fiction, quasi-fiction in a sense? And do you also think that Galatians could be utilizing Josephus, like how Acts does?
Where would the Josephus influence on Galatians be?
Well, I'm asking you.
I mean, do you have any particular element of Galatians in mind with that?
No, I guess I'll throw something in there. It's an example where I think a historical figure is being rewritten purposely to parallel somebody in Josephus. One example that I think is going on, if this helps, is I told you about it before.
Yeah,
is in the Clementine recognitions, you have a character called Matthias Barnabas,
Hmm.
and he has no interaction with Paul whatsoever,
Hmm.
and he's living in the 30s AD according to the Clementine recognitions. But in Galatians, Barnabas does interact with Paul, and he spends Paul and Barnabas. I think they spend 3 years with each other. He goes to Jerusalem. In fact, I'm going to pull up that passage real quick just to make sure that I'm not misremembering. Okay. All right. So to correct myself is that when he says in Galatians 2, then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. So in Josephus' life, there's a character called Banus. Now, just to be clear, I don't think Banus is literally Barnabas, but Barnabas is being rewritten by the author of Galatians to parallel Banus.
Oh.
So Banus spends 3 years with Josephus. Banus teaches Josephus, and Josephus becomes a Pharisee. And this is from 53 to 56 AD. We know that because Josephus is very specific about when that happened. And then it just happens to be that 14 years later, from 56 to 70 AD, Josephus goes to Jerusalem with Commander Titus. I just thought that was like an very odd chronological parallel between Josephus and Galatians. I just want to throw that in there.
Well, that opens yet another door here, and it's like the old "Let's Make a Deal" show. You know, what's behind door number one, door number two? It's an embarrassment of riches. I mean, the more data that comes to light here, the more difficult it becomes to pretend you can have a definitive answer because you got to deal that card in. I think that the most interesting aspect of a fictional Galatians, which I kind of think is true. I think that it is a pseudepigraph. I can't believe in the debate I had so long ago with Bart Ehrman, he just really snickered at the idea that anybody could think Galatians was not authentic. And I thought, well,
I remember
Karl Barth's teacher, Rudolf Steck, he believed that. Several people believed it. He just wasn't aware of it. Anyhow, let's see. I think that it is pseudepigraphical, and I'm tempted to go along with the theory that that really what you have here is Marcion or a Marcionite retrojecting what happened with Marcion into the time of Paul, and that for Paul to go to Jerusalem to get the approval of the original disciples for his gospel, and offering to sort of bribe them with a charitable gift, but it not being accepted because they eventually turn on him and knife him in the back, undermining his converts and all that. Sure, seems to ring a bell when you think of Marcion going to Rome with a big money gift and throwing his hat in the ring to be the bishop there. And they say, oh, gee, that's great. Ching. But then they say, nah, this guy's too far off. Here's your money back. Thanks, but no thanks. And he leaves and starts his own thing. I have to admit that is a powerful parallel. In fact, it reminds me of what you have constantly in the Quran, which of course is a bit later, where now we're going to tell you the secret history of Noah or Abraham or Moses. And eventually they get around to depicting the shouting matches the prophet had with the unbelievers, and they sound uncannily like those between Muhammad and his skeptics. If only his Lord would send down some sign from heaven and so forth. You wonder if the Muhammad thing was historical. Surely these are just based on it, providing him with precursors in whose footsteps he is walking. So you see, he's just like the prophets. and because he was one and the greatest of them. So Galatians kind of rings that way to me. And oh yeah, in terms of the James thing, oh yeah, I can't believe I left this out. I guess I might as well stick it in here. If I'm seemed even more mentally confused than usual, it's probably because I'm still dealing with bronchitis, which is why I'm a little raspier too. But let's see. You know, people, where do we get the idea that he was the brother of James? He was a brother of the Lord. Well, from this passage in Galatians, where Paul is speaking of his second, speaking of his second visit to Jerusalem, in which he saw, he's talking about his first visit. And he says he didn't see any of the apostles there except for Cephas, who presumably is Peter, who knows, and James, the Lord's brother. Well, hold on. Tertullian, interestingly, is trying to say, look, Paul was subordinate to the 12, or he never would have gone there to seek their imprimatur, which he did in his visit to Jerusalem. And his visit to Jerusalem, which in the canonical text says second visit to Jerusalem, or went up again, or whatever. The crucial word is missing. And so that if it read that way, that means the copy of Galatians that Tertullian was reading did not contain the passage about a prior visit in which Paul met James, the Lord's brother, and therefore didn't mention James, the Lord's brother. So that, I think, is a very important question mark beside the apologetics for historical James, historical Jesus. But suppose you insist, as Richard Carrier and others do, that, oh, no, we can't have any interpolations in the New Testament that aren't attested by manuscripts, because if it is, we're really up the creek and we won't know what to make of any passage.
Well, before you continue there, he does have interpolations without manuscript evidence, like 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, but just throwing that out there.
Well, that kind of underlines my point. What's the problem with this one? Suppose it really was in there. Are we sure we know what the brother of the Lord meant? Now, again, after all my hullabaloo after the Caliphate of James, I admit it's an entirely natural and perfectly plausible reading of that phrase, though it doesn't explain it. So you have to ask, are there any other likely, believable explanations? And Richard says he thinks it just means, well, I met Cephas and James the Christian. What? Because Christians are all the brethren of the Lord. Get out of here. That nobody would say that. So what else might it mean? Well, here I think you have to give some weight to the theory of G.A. Wells, who said that there's evidence in the New Testament for a group of missionaries called the Brethren of the Lord, and they were, I don't know what distinguished them, but he says, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, why can't I travel with a sister as wife, as do Cephas and the brethren of the Lord? Well, again, he can't mean and the Christians. He must have some definite group in mind. And it's probably the group that is mentioned in 3 John, where the elder, whoever he is writing to the only holdout in one of the churches he presides over, who will still open the door to the delegates he sends out. Others have been warned against them because they're afraid they're Gnostic heretics. But the elder doesn't know that yet. And he says, well, I guess the local head of your church, Diotrephes, just such an arrogant SOB. He doesn't want any input from a guy like an old oldster like me. He wants to run the show. It's not that. It's that he's heard weird docetic preaching from these other people who were delegates of the elder, but changed their minds on docetism and didn't tell him, so they could still appeal to his authorization, which they knew they wouldn't have if they came out at home with their real beliefs. And so the elder, in writing 3rd John, doesn't know that yet. He does in 2nd John and 1st John, because that's where he says you should do what Diotrephes does. If one of these heretics comes to your door with a watchtower or something, slam it in their face. I knew a guy, a philosophy professor, a good friend of mine, who was a Greek Orthodox believer. And he said whenever the witnesses or the Mormons would come to the door, he would slam it with the exclamation, "Get the F out of here." Well, that was sort of the approach recommended by the elder. So that's what was going on. But before he knew it was, he tells Gaius, to whom he writes the letter, his only friend left in that church, he says, we ought to see to the needs of the brethren who have gone out under the name without any other provisions. Well, who's he talking about? It's explicit. His representative prophets or evangelists or teachers. And finally, Matthew 25. Who are the sheep? Right? And who are the goats? Well, the sheep are those that help the poor and preach the social gospel, right? No. The goats are the people that did not give ear to Christian evangelists. And I got good news for you, the coming of the kingdom of God. And get out of here. And remember where Jesus sends them out in the mission charge in all 3 synoptics. And he says, if they listen to you, let your peace descend upon the house. God will keep them and you safe. And they'll feed you. You don't need to take any provisions. God will supply your needs through those who accept your message. But as for those who won't, who do the door slamming routine, you tell them, look, guy, you'll be sorry. The kingdom of God is coming. And I don't want to be associated with your hell-bound village, even by having the dust of your street on my feet. So I'm going to shake it from my sandals because you got hell to pay. Well, who are the brethren that the sheep helped, but the goats didn't? The brethren, the wandering missionaries. Because what did the goats do wrong? You didn't give them shelter. You didn't feed them. You didn't visit them in prison. All the stuff that Jesus said the righteous sheep will do. The people that hear the gospel and accept it. So it seems to me that once you realize what that's really about, you've got really all the evidence you need for there being another group of missionaries. In fact, the earliest view of the 12 didn't make them into missionaries, right? They'll sit on 12 thrones judging the tribes of Israel. These guys went out far and wide. So it seems to me that it's not that difficult to explain away the Galatians reference to the brother of the Lord as meaning something else than a physical sibling of Jesus. Though again, that's not a nutty theory. I want to be clear about that. That has its own strength and would answer questions of its own. So I'm sort of left between, I'm like the donkey poised between the 2 haystacks. Which one do I start munching first?
So, what do you think that we can know about James, since Galatians is fiction and it's 2nd century arguments being retrojected into the past using names of 1st century people?
Well,
Did historical James engage in any arguments at all that we know of?
No, not for certain. But I'm assuming assuming that whoever did write these things still had a living memory of who the figureheads of the different factions were. That if you had like in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul was long dead, so was Peter, but we have the two compared side by side in such a way as to say, hey, you Paulinists, I know you hate Peter, but why? Look at the stuff he did. It's just like what your guy did. Petrinists, you hate Paul as a false apostle, but look, he did the same stuff. I mean, miracle for miracle. You can just line them up. If God was behind one of them, he must have been behind both. Well, that's not historical material, all these crazy miracles and all that, and the particular things credited to them, like the Acts 15 speech of Peter is obviously something Paul might have said, not what Peter is usually thought to have said. But they did know that the factions that were feuding, that they were trying to get back together, did represent or claim they represented the teachings of these figureheads. And so I'm assuming there is at least that much to it, that they just arbitrarily pick these guys. Even in the case of Simon Magus, if Bauer and Volkmar were right, and Dettering, that Paul and Simon Magus were the same guy, that's just a more complicated use of the figurehead, splitting him into two because two different factions had come to appeal to the same guy. And so they decided to tailor one of them in order to make him their good guy and the other the bad guy. But that's the same principle still. Like, were there Matthias Christians? I mean, supposedly there were Thomas Christians in India. Could be, I don't know. But here we have at least something a bit closer to the original time of early organized Christianity with Acts, even though it's 2nd century.
Would you say that in a way Marcion would you say Marcion in a way is calling himself Paul when he wrote Galatians? He views himself as a new Paul, kind of like,
at least, yes,
like what we see in Acts when Saul, and as you know, there's a certain guy called Saul, and Jerome mentions that's living way after the original Paul supposedly lived, and he becomes Paul. He's not really Paul, but he became Paul, just like we see in Acts. So you think there's kind of a situation like that going on with Marcion whenever he wrote Galatians.
That's right. All you would need to explain that is for Marcion to have written Galatians or any of the other epistles, and but under the name of Paul, assuming people would get the reference, and some did and some didn't. So some figured, well, these are really Marcion's epistles. Marcion is the real author here, but others just naturally, as almost everybody does today. So it says Paul, I'm assuming it is. And so they may have accidentally split that author into, it's like if you read Edgar Rice Burroughs's book, Princess of Mars, where Captain John Carter is taken off to the Red Planet and so on. But he came back to Earth to tell his adventures to his friend, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and he wrote him down. Well, there was a real Edgar Rice Burroughs, but he made all the stuff up. But if you were naive enough to take this as true fact, you might say, well, I know Burroughs' name appears to it, but it was dictated by John Carter. You're really reading the Adventures of John Carter by John Carter. It's not that tough to imagine how people will quote what Plato has Socrates saying as Socrates, though there's a pretty good chance it's Plato, not Socrates. But what the heck? Or did Shakespeare write all the plays? There's some doubt, but what the hell if we're going to say we're quoting Hamlet was as Shakespeare said. it doesn't really matter. It's easy to see how you could get mix-ups like that.
So who do you think this person called James or Cephas really are in the 2nd century? Who are these opponents that Marcion, quote unquote, Paul is arguing with? Who are those two men?
Well, I would guess that if Cephas is supposed to be Peter, it's possible that the Roman hierarchy was already claiming to be Peter, to be headed by Peter's successor, and maybe they just decided to slap James and John on to the either side of him. Since he's sort of the successor of Jesus, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's who they thought he was, the successor of Peter. And so, if he's the one that gave the pink slip to Marcion, it would be natural to sort of adopt that. If you're going to claim Paul's authority, well, to have one of the other dramatis personae in, you might as well call him the appropriate figure, namely Peter. But I'm just speculating, of course, but this would make sense to me.
Would it be fair to suggest that under those circumstances that Bishop Pius I, the one that expelled Marcion from Rome, would it be fair to suggest that the opponents of Paul in Galatians, so-called Paul, are just different representations of the bishopric of Pius I?
It would, except the one fly in the ointment is, why does he say the troublemakers he's facing are men from James rather than Peter? But I don't know. I mean, even what I'm saying is so sketchy and vague as a pure speculation.
So now I want to shift back to Tertullian. You mentioned that Tertullian doesn't seem to know Galatians 1:19, that James is the Lord's brother. Were you also suggesting that Tertullian also didn't know about Paul's second trip to Jerusalem either?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That yeah, he doesn't know that James is mentioned in our text.
So do you think Tertullian's reading Marcion's Galatians, that kind of, I know there's conflicting reconstructions on it, but it kind of reminds me a little bit about how Marcion's version of Galatians looks like, since it's also missing the Lord's brother.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And remember, Tertullian has this shocking statement, though I admit it's ambivalent, that Marcion discovered the epistle to the Galatians. What does that mean? Well, it sounds to me like it's the priest and the others discovering the book of the law in the temple, or Joseph Smith discovering the Book of Mormon. No. It sounds like something is afoot there. And if what he meant was to say that Marcion really concocted the book, or if that's what the truth that lay behind the report that he heard to the effect that Marcion actually came to learn of it, then maybe nonetheless that means that Marcion fabricated it. And since Tertullian likes Galatians, at least in the form he knows it, and does argue as if Paul wrote it, he might well have thought, well, this is Marcion happened to stumble on this, and too bad he misread it so bad. I got a mischievous cat who's about to wreak some destruction if I don't stop him. Oops, just a second. Okay, I think
No problem.
He's a good boy.
All right.
Come on now. Come on. Okay. Got to watch out. It's October now, and he's a black cat with yellow eyes. Who knows what demonic fiendishness he may be up to.
So when you look at the way that you just mentioned that Marcion discovering Galatians could indicate that he fabricated it.
Mm.
And would you say that that would conflict with other reports about Marcion abridging Paul? Because if discovering Galatians is what like you interpret it to mean, he fabricated it, then he had the first version of Galatians. He didn't abridge it.
I'm still working on that paradigm, but you could say that nonetheless, he thought that, well, he discovered it, but of course there was stuff in it he didn't like, so he sniffed it out. He could easily have thought that it's. Oh no, I'm sorry. No. You're saying if he actually wrote it, he wouldn't have said. Yeah. If Tertullian thought Marcion wrote it, he wouldn't also be accusing Marcion of clipping out material. So that would imply that he didn't think Marcion had concocted it. Right. Yeah, yes. That's a very good argument.
Yeah, and
whether or not he did, but just in
right,
terms
there are church fathers before Tertullian that do mention Galatians without claiming that Marcion discovered it. And there, I think, would be a difference with your Hilkiah analogy, that because the difference there is that when Hilkiah discovered it, the king acted like he never heard of it before.
Yeah, right.
And nobody before Hilkiah's time mentioned the law in any way. So there it makes it you can make a more clear-cut case that Hilkiah fabricated a version of the law right there on the spot, whereas with Marcion, it's kind of a different situation because church fathers before Tertullian mentioned that Paul wrote Galatians without saying that Marcion discovered it. So,
well, of course, they could have just fallen for the scam, so to speak.
At the same time, Tertullian claims that Marcion wrote his New Testament with a sword, not a pen. So there's that.
You think we could do a GoFundMe to afford to buy a time machine and go back to find out for real what happened? Of course, I don't really speak the relevant languages, so that wouldn't work either.
Yeah, unfortunately, it ain't that simple.
My voice is beginning to give out. I should probably.
Sure. I think we touched on the main points anyway.
Oh boy, what fun!
All right, everybody. I have the links to a bunch of books by Bob Price in the description below. A lot of links down there, all affiliate links. So if you click on any of them and buy through those links, I get a small cut since I'm an Amazon affiliate. So you'll be supporting me and Bob at the same time. And that being said, as always, Bob, always good to have you on.
Oh, it's great to be on. I love it. Well, see you soon.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.